Welcome, everyone. My name is Rima Jabado, and I am the chair of the IUCN Shark Specialist Group. We are a volunteer network of 237 members from 83 countries and territories, and we're all working on the conservation of shark, rays, and chimeras, a group that I will refer to as sharks. Earlier this year, we established a working group on human dimensions in relation to shark conservation. So Hollie Booth and Dr. Divia Carnet, who you'll hear from today, are currently co-chairing this group. And one of the first tasks that they wanted to accomplish was to organize this short course and make it available to anyone interested in shark conservation and working with communities. So you'll learn a lot over the coming days, but shark conservation is a very complex issue. Over the last decade, we have made some incredible progress when it comes to the conservation of species, but populations are still declining around the world, and we really are facing a biodiversity crisis. And much of the work in the previous decades has focused on a top-down approach to managing fisheries and sharks. But we really want to start making a difference on the ground and making sure that we can implement management measures. And to do this, we have to work with those individuals that are actually fishing for sharks and who depend on them for their livelihoods. So just as a quick introduction to Hollie and Divya, Hollie Booth is a conservation scientist with over a decade of experience working on cross-cutting conservation issues. She has a diverse career and a research background spanning 3 continents and working on shark and ray management in Indonesia, protected area management in East Africa, with a particular focus on anti-poaching and wildlife law enforcement in Tanzania, community-based tourism in rural Ethiopia, and international environmental policy. She has a master's in conservation science from Imperial College London and is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford. Her work focuses on people-centered approaches to shark and ray conservation, and she's exploring the neglected socioeconomic complexities of shark conservation, how to manage trade-offs between shark conservation and fisheries objectives, understanding the impact of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, so CITES, on elasmobranch trade, and integrated approaches to tackling overexploitation of marine megafauna. Dr. Divia Carnet is a trained ecologist and human geographer. She has over close to 2 decades of experience working on threatened marine species and fisheries in the global south. Her experience ranges from shark and ray research and conservation to sea turtle research and seafood sustainability and indigenous fisheries governance. She's interested in applied research that brings together indigenous perspectives, practices of consumption, and diverse economic approaches to achieve conservation. She has a PhD from Rutgers University in the United States and is currently working as an assistant professor of environmental studies at Ashoka University in India. She's done most of her shark and ray work as a senior fellow at the Foundation for Ecological Research, Advocacy and Learning. And she co-founded India's first sustainable seafood initiative, In Season Fish, which looks at approaches to shark conservation through programs about sustainable seafood, which involves chefs, seafood eaters, fishers, and conservationists. So over the next, we have 5 days that we are going to be meeting at the same time. And so today, the 27th of July, the 29th of July, and then next week on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th of August. And they have a lineup of some fantastic speakers from all around the world that have experience with working with fisher communities in various ways to really push through shark conservation. So today, much of the course is going to be focused on human dimensions, what, why, and how. On Thursday, we're going to start delving into an overview of all of the social science research methods. And then next week, we'll have case studies on understanding the socio-ecological situation, how to design interventions and change behaviors, and a lot more discussions on the last day that are really focused on future directions for human dimensions of shark conservation. And without further ado, I'll let Hollie start off with the course for today. Thank you.
There we go. Hope you can all hear me. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rima, for the introduction. So I'm just going to get us started with day one, which is a sort of overview on human dimensions, what, why, and how. Before we get started, just a quick bit of housekeeping. You probably noticed that you're all on mute. That's because we've had an overwhelming number of registered participants. We've had sort of hundreds of people register. And we just wanted to sort of keep things organized and make sure we didn't have any kind of random background noises. So everybody's on mute, and if you'd like to make a comment or question, then please do that in the chat. And as I say, we'll mainly only be accepting Q&A via the chat for now. We may change that later depending on how things go. We're also planning to use Vevox to facilitate audience participation. So you can do this by scanning the QR code that you can see on the screen now with your phone, or by just going to vevox.app and entering that ID. And at various points throughout the talk, you'll see this little logo. It will appear in the top right-hand corner. And when it does, that means that there's some kind of poll or some kind of interactive questions or session that we're about to do. And as Rima already said, please be aware that we'll be recording the session so that we can share them online. Also, just to say, this is the first time both Divya and I have done a sort of online seminar of this scale. And I really hope that my laptop is going to be up to the challenge of the bandwidth. So please do excuse if there's any technical glitches along the way, but hoping that won't be the case. So the agenda for today is we're going to be first of all talking about what do we mean by human dimensions, and what are we actually going to cover during the course. Then we're going to be talking about an overview of why human dimensions are important for shark conservation. And then finally, we're going to be talking about how to frame, understand, and influence human dimensions in shark conservation. And I'm hoping that this talk today is going to provide a sort of broad overview and a broad framing for the rest of the week, and for why this type of work is really important for shark conservation. Every day, we're going to have a few learning objectives that we're going to put up on the screen at the beginning. And then it would be nice if we can sort of reflect on these objectives at the end as well. So by the end of today, you should hopefully understand some of the moral and practical imperatives for considering the human dimensions of shark conservation. You should understand some theories of human behaviour, and you should understand some approaches for changing behaviour in conservation and when different approaches might be useful. So to get us started, what are the human dimensions of shark conservation? As you can see, we've got this little Vevox sign up in the corner, and that we have a poll on that website now. And if you want to go ahead and sort of head to that little website, or you scan the QR code, and you can put in some of your thoughts, and it will generate a word cloud in terms of what you guys think the human dimensions of shark conservation are. I've realized I need to try and let me stop share this and share my other screen instead, so you guys can see some of the things that are popping up. So community, livelihoods, attitudes, understanding, culture, socioeconomic, ethics, conflict, brilliant, lots of interesting stuff here. Food, fishery, surfers' perceptions, very interesting. Welfare, brilliant. So loads of great ideas there. You guys can keep entering your ideas. I'm just going to go back to the presentation. So in shark conservation, human dimensions can include many things, as the word cloud has already shown. This can be things like using social sciences to gather biological and ecological information, understanding the threats to sharks as a result of human actions, so fisheries and trade, and some of the underlying socioeconomic drivers of those threats, so fishers' perceptions and economic and cultural values. It can include designing and implementing interventions to address those threats, so changing behaviour, and interventions which are both effective and ethical. And it can include advocacy, public engagement, and consumer change. And we're going to cover, to some degree, all of these topics throughout the next 5 days. In particular, days 2 and 3 are going to focus on using social sciences to gather biological and ecological information. And we're also going to be talking about understanding direct threats to sharks as a result of human actions on days 2 and 3 as well. Day 4 is going to focus a lot on designing and implementing interventions to address those threats. And then on day 5, we're going to hear a bit more about advocacy, public engagement, and consumer change. So why do we need to consider human dimensions in shark conservation? So there's a few different reasons, which I'm going to just briefly talk through now. So on the one hand, we all know that people inflict direct damage on shark populations through overfishing and habitat destruction. So for example, a recent study that just came out this year estimates that global abundance of oceanic sharks and rays has declined by over 70% in the past half a century. And this is primarily attributed to an 18-fold increase in relative fishing pressure. So human actions are causing these negative impacts on sharks. And we need to find ways to prevent and manage damaging behaviours. And getting fewer dead sharks ultimately requires changing human behaviour. I think there's sort of a growing acknowledgement now in the conservation community that most conservation is actually behaviour change. And this involves influencing behaviour and decision-making of fishers sort of at the point of catch. So I don't know if anybody knows who these two people are, but they're sort of some of the godfathers of behavioural economics. So this is Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler, who've done huge bodies of work on behavioural economics. And the key conclusion is that human behaviour and decision making is quite complicated. And if we don't consider all of the sort of complex aspects of human behaviour, then we're going to end up with implementation failure in terms of conservation interventions. So some of the different types of things we might need to consider are cognitive biases, social influences, and these include things like social networks, local institutions, leadership, and human capital. And often we find that we have these sort of neglected socioeconomic complexities. So until now, we've had lots of research that's focused on the many different species of sharks and their different biophysical characteristics. We have lots of research that focuses on fisheries and their different operational characteristics. And increasingly, we have these efforts to address macroeconomic drivers, such as in international policy under the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. So we can understand species vulnerabilities, we can understand the direct threats to species, and we can understand some of these high-level drivers. But we have this sort of implementation gap in the middle. And so we also have many local contexts with different socioeconomic drivers and constraints at the local level. And we need to sort of understand these local level drivers and threats for effective shark conservation. And then on the other hand, there are relationships between humans and sharks, which means that people gain benefits from shark populations. And we need to find ways to maintain and align these benefits whilst also trying to reduce the threats to sharks. So we've got another little interactive poll here. So I'm just going to stop that share for a second and go back to the poll screen. Hang on a minute. So close poll. Can I start the next one? I'm just getting to grips with this. Sorry. So here we go. So what are some of the values that sharks provide to humans? And I'm going to share this in a second. There we go, show results, and hoping that'll come up. Hang on a second, it doesn't seem to be coming up. Show results, there we go. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that. So food, tourism, livelihoods, spiritual, cultural, intrigue, I like that. Adventure, ecosystem services, subsistence. So food and tourism seem to be some of the really big ones coming out here. Economic as well. So all of these are great suggestions. I'm just going to go back to my PowerPoint. Actually trying to skip in between the PowerPoint and the VBox is a little more complicated than I expected. There we go. So as everybody sort of mentioned on the word cloud, there are a range of different values that sharks provide to humans. So fisheries and food, ecosystem function, culture, and of course, ecotourism. And all of these values are really important for different people in different places. But unfortunately, sometimes we have conflicting values. So on the one hand, we have values for conserving sharks, so healthy populations of sharks and rays and their existence values, which sometimes come into conflict with coastal livelihoods, so productive fisheries, income and food security, and consumptive use. And often there's the sort of statement made that sharks and rays are worth more alive through tourism, but the question is, to whom? Who actually gains this value? And often we find that tourism values and fisheries values don't necessarily accrue in the same places or for the same people. So we have these questions around who benefits and which kind of benefits do they get and when do they benefit? And so essentially we need to sort of reconcile the priorities of local people and nature. So a conservation problem like shark overfishing usually implies that rules are needed, and typically somebody suffers when rules are imposed or enforced, at least in the short run, because it's going to result in reduced catches, for example. Other people might benefit, but the benefits might be slow to come. And the question is, are the right people benefiting or losing? Who actually gets to benefit from conservation interventions? So the sort of ultimate goal, at least under the new Convention on Biological Diversity strategic plan, is living in harmony with nature by 2050. And a sort of vision for sharks and rays under this might be healthy populations of sharks and rays which provide benefits to people and ecosystems. And the big question is, how do we actually get fewer dead sharks and rays so that we have healthy populations of sharks and rays, whilst minimizing the negative impacts or maximizing the positive impacts of conservation on people? And this is actually a very tricky question. And to be honest, conservation in general doesn't have a great track record. Even now, we often hear of these human rights abuses associated with conservation actions. And this means that we also need an ethical code for conservation. So I really recommend this very brief paper. It's in the reading list at the end about conservation and human rights. And in general, sort of adopting the idea of that conservation intervention should at least not damage and should ideally improve the well-being of the most vulnerable people. And we're going to talk a little bit more about research ethics tomorrow as well. So to sort of recap on this overarching question, why do we need to consider human dimensions? Essentially, there's both a practical and ethical reason to consider the human dimensions of shark conservation. The practical one is that reducing overfishing requires changing human behaviour. And the ethical one is that reducing overfishing results in costs and benefits for different people, which will also in turn affect behaviour. So how can we find ways to change damaging behaviour which also respect local people's rights and wishes? The sort of big ultimate question. So the first step is that we understand behaviour with mutual respect. And this often requires understanding and respecting people who might have worldviews which are quite different from our own. So how can we understand behaviour? I find one of the most useful theories for thinking about behaviour is something called the theory of planned behaviour. So this is a model that comes from social psychology, and it's one of the most widely used and widely tested theories of behaviour in terms of trying to understand what actually drives people's decisions. And broadly, it sort of states that people's attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioural control determine people's intentions to perform a behaviour and their behaviour. What does this actually mean? I'm going to go through this with some shark-specific examples. So, a behavioural belief is, what does an individual think about this behaviour? What is my individual attitude towards this behaviour, and what are my sort of personal personality traits? And this attitude might be something like, catching a shark will provide food for my family. And eating shark meat is good for my family. And this results in an overall attitude, which is catching sharks is a good thing for me to do. Then the other part that's important is sort of normative beliefs and social norms. So what do other people think about this behaviour? Is this something that's acceptable in my community? So my friends and family approve of me being a shark fisher, and behaving how my friends and family expect is important to me. And so this results in a subjective norm. So people might feel social pressure to be a shark fisher. And then control beliefs are related to people's capacity to do a certain behaviour and potential perceived barriers. So it might be something like, it's easy for me to become crew on a shark fishing boat. And if I become crew on a shark fishing boat, it will be easy for me to catch sharks. And so this translates into sort of a perceived control, which is, I'm confident I could catch a shark if I wanted to. And then together, these combine into a sort of intention. So I intend to go and catch a shark, and then the eventual behaviour of catching a shark. But also intention doesn't necessarily result in behaviour, because there can be some intervening sort of environmental context issues that might stop that from happening, such as weather, for example. So sort of the two big questions that we're going to cover during the course is how to understand and measure behaviour. And so we might use things like individual attitude surveys to understand attitudes. We might use focus group discussions to understand social norms. We might use observation in the field to understand perceived control. We might use things like willingness to pay or scenario interviews to understand people's preferences or intentions for different behaviour. And then monitoring actual behaviour can sometimes be a tricky one, especially when conservation behaviours are sensitive. So sometimes we can just ask people, when was the last time you went fishing? But sometimes this might involve indirect questioning or other types of observation to really understand behaviour. And the reliability of these different methods basically depends on how sensitive the behaviour is. And then there's the other big question is, how do we influence behaviour? And so we can influence behaviour by thinking about all these different components of behaviour. So we might influence somebody's evaluation of a behavioural outcome by offering them direct payments or offering them alternative livelihoods. We might influence the social norms associated with the behaviour by engaging with village leaders or by conducting social marketing. We might influence people's motivation to comply with a certain law or regulation through things like law enforcement or community-based management. And we might influence people's perceived control over a behaviour through things like offering alternatives. People might think, I've got no other options than to be a shark fisher, but we can offer alternatives to change their perceived control. Or it could be things like small nudges or new technology that reduces bycatch, for example. And so day 2 and 3 are going to be focused on this sort of understanding and measuring, and day 4 and 5 are going to be focused on this kind of influencing behaviour. So what are some of the implications of the theory of planned behaviour for shark conservation? A big one is that changing people's attitudes isn't usually enough on its own to change behaviour. And this has important implications for things like awareness raising campaigns. And in terms of whether awareness raising on its own normally works, evidence suggests that it probably doesn't on its own work to change behavior. So more people might be aware of certain issues, but it's not enough alone to actually alter people's behavior. So people's behavior is actually a product of their own individual views. What do I think about this behavior? Is it good for me? Is it good for my family? Their motivations, how much money am I going to get from this? How much food am I going to get from this? Their capacities. So do I have a boat? Do I have the fishing gear? Can I go and do this? And their perceptions of the societal and environmental context. What do other people think about this behavior? What is my environment and how is it going to intervene in my intentions? And even intention isn't enough. People have to feel that they are able to change their behavior. So as this nice little meme of a cat, somebody might want to change their livelihood to something else, or somebody might want to go on a diet, but for whatever reason, there are intervening factors that mean that they just feel like they can't actually change their behavior. And I just wanted to sort of quickly point out this interesting new paper that I think just came out today, actually, which is about how conservation scientists can use behavioral sciences more effectively. And the main thing I wanted to sort of focus on is that when you do sort of behavior change approaches to conservation, they can focus both on the individual level, so looking at an individual's capabilities and their motivations, but then also at the sort of broader population level. So, what's the environment in terms of both the sort of the physical setting, the economic setting, and also people's wider social norms as well. So we need to think about all these different complex components of behavior. So based on that, human dimensions are quite complex. And so we need to think about how can we frame, understand, and influence them in a shark conservation context. I've got another quick poll for you. So I'm just going to stop sharing and go back to the poll. Let's stop that. Okay, so I'm interested in what you guys think. I'm just presenting sort of two different interventions. And I want to know whether you agree or disagree with the different intervention types. So the first one is sharks should be fully protected. Interesting. So we have about 50% of people who disagree, and then the others are sort of split 50-50 between agree and neutral. Okay. So I'm going to stop this poll and go to the next one, which is, oops, hang on a minute. Here we go. Hopefully this is working. Sustainable shark fisheries are a good idea. I think I need to press show results. Wow, we seem to have quite a strong, overwhelming agree here. Interesting. Okay. So in the next part of the presentation, I'm going to just sort of talk through some of these different policy mechanisms and behavior change mechanisms for shark conservation. So I just need to reshare my screen. Great. So a sort of simpler approach to think about behaviour is essentially that people act based on incentives. And when I say incentives, I don't necessarily just mean monetary payment incentives, but incentives in the broadest sense. So there are a range of different types of incentives. These can be positive and negative. They can be extrinsic, so that's sort of money or food, and intrinsic, so that's sort of social values and warm, fuzzy feelings. And they can be direct and indirect. So that might be, directly paying somebody to do something, or directly fining somebody if they do something, or it could be indirect through, for example, an alternative livelihood. And we can sort of typically think that people weigh up the pros and cons of their actions and change their behavior accordingly. And so how can we influence people's behavior? We can think about how do we change the incentives. And so I'm going to talk through a few different models in the next few slides. So prohibition of use and regulated use are two potential approaches, and these usually involve rules and punishments, and typically include negative incentives. Then I'm going to talk about alternatives and payments. And so these usually involve positive incentives, so direct payments or clear benefits for doing something else. And I should say that regulated use can also involve positive incentives as well, if sustainable use is implemented well. And then finally, I'm going to talk about goodwill and non-use values. And this is sort of social values and things like non-monetary incentives and warm fuzzy feelings, for example. So prohibition of use, this is your sort of, it's a bit out of fashion, but it's sort of your classic most widespread form of conservation. And this is why I asked everybody that question about, sharks should be fully protected, because this would be under this kind of model. And it works by, you make some rules, you monitor compliance, you apply sanctions. So if people aren't complying with the rules, you punish them. And then as a result, the users comply with the rules. It's sort of an extreme end of a spectrum of rules and regulations. It's based on the idea that nature is a social good, and that members of society should comply with rules set for how it should be used. It can be done at any level by any type of institution, but most often by governments. And it can be effective, so things like ivory bans and some protected areas, for example. So when will it work? Unfortunately, it's probably necessary for the most threatened species, which can't really handle any form of use or disturbance. So this might be things like mountain gorillas or, for example, sawfish. And it usually works when society agrees that it's appropriate. But actually, this is very complicated. Who is society? Not everybody agrees. So to give an example from a whaling opinion poll, there's nothing wrong with whaling if it's properly regulated. In Australia, 67%, and in the UK, around 67% of people disagree. But in Norway and Japan, most people agree. And you can ask a very similar question about sustainable shark fisheries. So interestingly, many people in this group, 80% said that actually sustainable shark fisheries are a good idea. But if you ask different demographics and the other 20% in the group who disagreed, you might have quite different opinions. Also, it typically works when people believe they will face serious consequences. But what are serious consequences? So this depends on the penalty, the likelihood of being caught, and the benefit if you're not caught. And this can result in some very serious ethical dilemmas and things like shoot on sight policies for stopping poaching, which are quite sort of ethically tricky. But based on this economic analysis, it sort of showed that that it was the only sort of viable option that had a high enough cost that would stop people from poaching due to the extremely high value of ivory and rhino horn. And the trouble is, in the end, it's kind of addressing the symptoms, sort of sticking a plaster approach, rather than the sort of ultimate drivers of declines in biodiversity. So an example from a sort of shark and ray perspective is full legal protection of manta rays in Indonesia, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later. So the next sort of broad approach in the list is regulated use. So the idea is that you calculate sustainable use levels, you institute some sort of management framework, and then users harvest within these set limits. This is the fundamental basis for most types of fishing, wildlife harvest, and forestry. It also requires a certain set of rules, and often monitoring and compliance management. So you might still have rules around how much is allowed and what types of harvesting methods are allowed, and you might still have fines for people who are breaking those rules. It takes a sort of materialistic perspective, so nature is there to be used, and both society and the users gain if use is sustainable, and resources are valued for their use value rather than for their intrinsic values. This can be risky for endangered species or where data are poor. When does this normally work? So resilient and productive species that can handle harvesting. When sustainable harvest is profitable, or there's another way in which the costs of reduced harvests are met. So it's when sustainability, long-term sustainability, is in the interest of the resource users. It helps if it's easy to monitor as well, so you can make sure that it is indeed sustainable and that resource users aren't cheating. And when users don't have to wait too long for the overexploited resources to recover. So you might want to set some use limits, but sometimes this can be tricky because it creates sort of short-term opportunity costs to the resource users. It's also usually important to have strong institutional structures to manage the resource and the users, and to enforce the rules and monitor the system. And so a good example of this is sort of these bright spots of sustainable shark fishing, which is a paper by Colin Simpfendor and Nick Dulvey from a few years ago. And these show that while there aren't many, there are some examples of science-based sustainable shark fisheries. And you know, this kind of reinforces the point that you need you know, very strong institutions and science-based monitoring, because most of these examples are in sort of hyper-developed economies that have got lots of resources and technology that they're putting into ensuring their shark fishing is sustainable. There's also some other great examples on the CITES and Livelihoods website. So these aren't shark and mouse specific, but there are great examples for a range of other species where sustainable use has helped to both provide conservation outcomes and also provide social and economic outcomes for local people using those resources. And this is a great resource, and I really recommend going to visit that link if you haven't seen it already, and going to check out some of these really nice examples of how sustainable use can support livelihoods. So alternatives. This is often used as a you know, an idea for shark fishers. Can't we just give them something else to do? And the very simple idea is, you know, you investigate some alternative livelihoods, you somehow alter the attractiveness of that alternative, and as a result, the resource users or the shark fishers shift to this alternative form of fishing. And it usually involves developing other income streams. Sometimes it can be considered sort of conservation by distraction or persuasion rather than coercion. So, you know, rules and regulations are more coercion, and this is more, you know, giving people something else to do. People change their destructive behavior because they have a better way of making their living. And it's based on the idea that people have the moral right to choose to make their livelihoods as they wish within local societal norms. And if wider society wants them to change their behavior, then a viable alternative activity must be made available to them. It's kind of popular as a win-win solution in theory, but often this can be really difficult to implement in practice for a range of different reasons. It also raises more questions. Why should damaging users be compensated? Who is the local entitled to the benefits and who is not? So actually sort of administering these in practice can be very tricky. When will it work? I think when there's a clearly defined community, when there's realistic, robust, genuine alternatives as close to the original livelihood as possible. So it needs to be marketable and profitable. It needs to be socially desirable and aligned with people's existing aspirations. It needs to serve a similar socioeconomic function. So you need to ask yourself, is it just about the money? Or is it also about some other type of sort of social status associated with that job? You know, we all know as conservationists, your job is part of your identity. It's not just about the money, otherwise we certainly wouldn't be doing conservation. So you sort of need to think about these other social functions of people's jobs as well. It needs to align with people's capacities and interests. Do people have the equipment and the capacity? And this is often a real issue with ecotourism as an alternative to shark fishing, because typically people who catch sharks don't necessarily have the have the resources and the capacity and the language training to be able to sort of host tourists in their communities. The alternative also needs to be sustainable. You don't want to shift people from one unsustainable practice to another. And really, you need to ask yourself, why wasn't this already in use? Why aren't people already doing it? And crucially, the economics needs to be right. So it's an indirect approach, and it can be hard to get the incentives right. There can be perverse incentives. So for example, if people have increased wealth, they might then go and buy more fish. Or the livelihood might be additional rather than a substitute. So for example, if you're offering people sort of, let's say, a seaweed farming or a sort of a fish drying option, that can actually be done in addition to going out to sea to catch sharks. So you just need to make sure that sort of all the economic incentives fit together properly. And I really recommend this paper from a while ago now by Juliet Wright, Reframing the Concept of Alternative Livelihoods. Is a great paper for talking through some of these issues. And for long-term sustainability, it's helpful to have an explicit linkage between the alternative and the conservation target. So that might be that the benefits from the alternative are actually conditional on people signing some sort of agreement to say that they're not going to do the damaging behavior anymore. So an example of this is alternative fisheries in Indonesia for shark fishers. And I'm not going to talk about this now, but we're going to hear more about this during Rafid's talk on day 4. So approach number 4, payments. This is essentially where you calculate the value of a resource or the cost of conservation. You identify your conservation service providers, and then you draw up some sort of contract or agreement to pay for the services. And then individuals conserve according to a contract, and you pay them for the conservation outcomes. So this is sort of broadly payments for ecosystem services, which involves the transfer of positive incentives to conservation providers where this provision is conditional on the provision of the service. So it might be compensation for agreeing to take conservation-induced losses. So this could be something like you set up a no-take zone, and a good example of this is Shark Reef in Fiji. Set up a no-take zone where fishers don't fish anymore, and you essentially pay fishers some kind of, you pay for their rights, for example, pay for the fishing rights for them not to fish in that area. Or payments for positive actions. So this might be things like paying people to guard a protected area, or it might be things like paying people to release certain species of conservation importance. So based on the idea that those who bear the costs of conservation should be directly compensated by those who benefit, economically, it's most efficient to do this through direct payments rather than indirect means like alternative livelihoods. Conditionality is a really powerful tool for ensuring conservation. And this means that essentially the payments or the benefits that are given to people are conditional on the conservation outcomes. And this can be a really strong way to influence behavior. So when does it work? Normally, there needs to be institutional structures that allow for fair, free, and informed negotiation and binding commitments between communities and the people who are paying for it. Monitoring is really crucial to conditionality. And we also need to take into account worries about commercialization and power imbalances, and things like the difference between cost and value. So there might be a difference between the cost of conservation for local people and the value of conservation to international communities. Sorry, I was just having a quick look at the chat to make sure I wasn't missing anything important. So a good example of this is pay to release for guitarfish in Brazil, which is what Natasha Vosnik is going to talk to us about on day 4 as well. And the final example I want to talk about just now is sort of changing underlying beliefs and attitudes. So it's sort of non-use value and goodwill. So this can be things like cultural values, so religious values, national pride and traditions, or other values associated with aesthetic value, existence value, educational value. And this is sort of your kind of capturing hearts and minds approach to conservation. So typically this involves kind of identifying some cultural and community values, working with opinion formers or social leaders to promote these values, and then the community modifies their behavior because of these sort of fundamental social norms. So working with local culture and institutions is shown in meta-analyses to be key for success in all conservation interventions. People change their behaviour because they feel it's the right thing to do, and they are prepared to incur the costs that are involved. Based on the idea that the most powerful reasons for change in behaviour are not actually financial, but are to do with social norms, personal beliefs, and values. And there are sort of two intertwined approaches. One is highlighting the non-use values of nature, so public awareness and cultural value. And the other is kind of building goodwill towards a conservation project rather than towards biodiversity directly. So this normally works in situations when economic imperatives aren't too strong. It may be more effective for flagship species or charismatic species, those which have strong cultural value and charismatic appeal. When cultural values are aligned with conservation goals, so this photograph on the right-hand side is from a paper by Infield et al. 2017, where they look at sort of cultural values and conservation. And in this example, you can see sort of traditional uses of plants it's kind of a cultural value and a cultural driver of why people might want to protect plants in Bwindi National Park in Uganda. And also when the messages are culturally appropriate. So, you know, this is quite an important consideration for awareness raising campaigns when, you know, it might focus on sort of the gruesome side of shark finning, for example, but potentially that doesn't actually resonate with the resource users. And so messages need to be sort of culturally adapted. It also helps when opinion formers and local leaders are convinced, because they can then help to convince other people. And then when the resource users themselves are convinced. So a couple of examples, the Ocean Ambassadors Program in Mozambique from the Marine Megafauna Foundation. And we're going to hear more about this during day 4 as well. And things like social and online marketing techniques. And we're going to hear more about this during Diogo's talk on day 5. So to conclude with a sort of summary of the approaches I've just gone over, number 1, prohibition abuse. It's a little bit out of fashion, but still the most widely used approach. And it may be necessary for the most threatened species. It requires effective enforcement, which creates strong disincentives, and it can be morally questionable in some cases. We've got regulated use, which normally works when you have resilient and productive species. Ideally a marketable product so that people can get financial benefits from sustainable use. Ideally easy to monitor with stable and well-developed institutions to ensure that sort of science-based management. We've got alternatives, which normally work when there's a defined community, realistic, robust, and genuine alternatives, which are ideally linked to the conservation targets. We've got payments, and those usually work when you have clear control over a resource by your sort of ecosystem service providers, and when there's monitoring to ensure those payments are conditional on real conservation outcomes. And then finally, you have the sort of goodwill and non-use values, which are typically crucial for all interventions and alone can work when the opportunity costs of conservation are not too high and when the conservation target has strong sort of charismatic or cultural appeal. And crucially, all of these approaches need resilient and effective local institutions and sustained commitment. Yes, so that just sort of summarizes those 3 approaches. So we're going to stop briefly for another question time. So if you guys want to go back to the poll, I'm going to close that previous poll. Hang on. So let's open this one. So I want to ask you guys about a couple of examples, and I want you guys to think about which kinds of interventions might be most effective in each situation. I'm going to try and present the results on my screen. There we go. Hopefully you can see that. I should say as well, you know, there's no right or wrong answers. I'm just sort of interested in people's perceptions of these different things. sort of alternatives and regulate use seem to be just about winning at the moment, but it does seem like real split opinions on this one. Okay, I'll give that another 20 seconds and then I'm going to stop and go on to the next question. So alternative seems to be just about winning with 35%. Maybe I actually shouldn't show you guys the results until everybody's voted, because it might, in fact, that's Social Sciences 101. I shouldn't be showing you the results until you've voted, because it might be influencing your vote. Okay, I'm going to close that poll. I'm going to go to the next one. Next poll. What about wedgefish bycatch in small-scale coastal fisheries? I'm going to leave it for a couple of seconds, actually, to let you guys vote before I show the results on the screen. Okay, let's show some results. Okay, regulate use at the moment seems to be winning. Okay, that seems to be quite stable. All right, I'm going to stop this one. And then go to the next one. What about commercial silky shark fishing? What do we think about this? Again, I'm just going to give it sort of 30 seconds for you guys to vote, and then okay, let's show some results. I'm finally figuring out how to actually use this now, that little show results button. Okay, interesting. Regulate use has got a real, is a real winner there. Very interesting. Okay, I'm going to stop that. Then, okay, I'm going to go back to my presentation to give you a quick case study to wrap up for today, and then we'll have a bit of Q&A. Hang on, let's go back to sharing my screen. Here we go, share. So in that last poll, I sort of asked you guys to, pick between one or the other. But actually, successful conservation interventions usually require a mixture of approaches at the same time. And this kind of acknowledges that, human behavior, even within one community, can be extremely diverse, and the drivers of behavior can be diverse. And so we might need to use different approaches to sort of tweak different components of overexploitation. And I'm going to talk through this a little bit with a case study based on some of my sort of practical experiences and PhD research on an integrated approach to tackling manta ray hunting in a manta ray fishery in Indonesia. So to give a quick bit of background, we have the protagonist here is the charismatic manta ray, which I'm sure everybody in this Zoom chat is very familiar with. And one of the most charismatic of the elasmobranchs, which everybody knows and loves. And it's kind of well known that there's been this sort of growing issue of sort of commercial international trade for manta ray gills, which in some cases has been driving overexploitation of manta rays and devil rays as well. And so in the past, Indonesia was thought to be, well, it is currently the world's largest shark and ray fishing nation in general, and was thought to be one of the world's largest manta and devil ray fisheries, and a sort of major source of gill plates to China, Hong Kong, and Singapore, based on some market studies conducted sort of back in sort of 2013, 2015. And within Indonesia is one of the world's largest targeted manta ray fisheries in East Flores in Indonesia. And this is a sort of a picture of, this isn't actually somebody hunting a manta ray, but this is what they do. They go out on these trips to target manta rays, and they sort of leap off their boat to spear them. This has been sort of made famous or infamous in the Racing Extinction documentary, and it's pretty gnarly. You guys can look this up on YouTube if you want to see a picture of how this goes. And so it's sort of estimated that in the early 2000s, there might have been as many as 1,000 manta rays killed per year. Initially, this started off as a sort of purely local subsistence type of fishing, and people used to have unmotorized boats, and they would just go on relatively short fishing trips to hunt manta rays just for local subsistence use. But as kind of international markets for gill plates grew and the value of gill plates grew, and people had sort of motorized boats, they could go out, fish further and fish more. There was sort of this explosion in manta ray catches, and it became this kind of unsustainable behavior. And an interesting example of where local cultural values, something that was already sort of a local subsistence cultural value, then interacted with these big macroeconomic drivers to result in this kind of explosion of manta ray hunting. So this site is in East Nusa Tenggara province in Indonesia. And in 2013, manta rays were added to Appendix 2 of the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. And then in 2014, the Indonesian government made the sort of strong and brave decision to declare manta rays fully protected. And this is in part because manta rays provide a lot of value to Indonesia in terms of dive tourism. So people fly from all over the world to come and scuba dive with manta rays in Indonesia. So this represents a sort of, a huge policy win, but something that's extremely difficult to implement in a place like Lamakera, where people have these sort of strong cultural and economic ties to manta ray fishing. So although this law came into place initially, some manta ray fishing did continue in Lamakera. And so a project was established, which was a partnership between different national and local government institutes and Missile Foundation, with support from some international donors as well. And essentially, there's a sort of a timeline of different activities that were implemented. So manta rays were declared fully protected in 2014. And then a sort of collaborative research program was established in Lamakera. And there was like this gradual implementation and adaptation of a conservation strategy. So yeah, sorry, here's the sort of timeline. So there was CITES COP16, there was the national policy, then there was some enforcement against traders, and then there was this sort of integrated local approach. So what did this local approach actually look like? So this theory of change sort of looks a little bit complicated, but the easiest way to think about it is that there was both a sort of positive incentives piece and a negative incentives piece. So there was sort of targeted community outreach, which is all sort of part of this, the warm fuzzy feeling social norms. And there was livelihood focused alternative livelihoods, which created incentives. And then there was sort of patrolling and enforcement against traders to create the sort of, enforcement disincentives. So to explain in a bit more detail, some of the activities that implemented, so the negative incentives helped to increase the effort of illegal hunting. So there was data-driven marine patrolling by the East Flores Fisheries Agency, conducted at key times and in key spatial hotspots. There's sort of routine, with a dual routine patrols and rapid response patrols. So based on data of known hunting patterns, so manta rays have these sort of upwelling and aggregation behavior. And so it was possible to sort of predict when large hunting events were likely to take place. And as a result, the East Flores Fisheries Agency could go and do these routine patrols in these sort of key times and hotspots, and that helped to focus patrolling effort in the sort of highest risk places for manta rays. And so these graphs here sort of show this red dotted line, which hopefully you can see, is sort of the predicted hotspot. And then the sort of dark blue shading shows the actual patrol density. And you can kind of see, in 2015, there were basically no patrols. In 2016, the patrols started, but they were kind of all over the place. And then 2017, you have this kind of increasingly targeted patrols around some of the hotspots, and you sort of see patrols increasing and becoming more focused, and the number of manta rays killed declining. There was also stop and search of boats and confiscations, as well as arrest and prosecution of high-level traders. So in terms of the boats, there wasn't targeted enforcement action against the fishers, the local fishers, because of sort of ethical concerns about that. But there was targeted enforcement action against high-level traders. So when there was a big bust of all of these manta ray gills, people were fined, and some people were also given jail time for these huge international illegal shipments of manta ray gills. And training was also provided to law enforcement officers, and we found there was actually an increase in sort of average fines and average sentences given to these high-level traders following training, specifically in sort of marine wildlife enforcement. Then, in terms of the positive incentives, we had livelihoods-based incentives were implemented. So profitable marine-based alternatives with benefits linked directly to compliance with regulations. So Missile Foundation set up a sustainable fisheries cooperative, and membership of that cooperative is contingent on people signing an agreement to say they're not going to catch manta rays anymore. So you can't be in the cooperative unless you sign the agreement to say, I don't want to catch them anymore. And anybody who is found catching manta rays will be removed from the cooperative. And so this is a sort of a mini purse seine vessel, which provides fishers with a marine-based but profitable alternative. So there's now around 120 cooperative members, including 28 ex-manta ray hunters, and fishers earn $35 to $53 per month, which is about comparable to manta ray hunting and also more stable by comparison. So they get this income every month, whereas manta ray hunting was kind of more seasonal and a bit more stochastic. There's also a store with discount for cooperative members and training in seafood product making for local female traders as well. And then there's also sort of building goodwill and beliefs and attitudes. So consistent outreach and socialization of regulations and building pride, non-monetary rewards for releasing megafauna with public recognition. So a network of over 470 local community rangers was recruited, and 42 protected marine animals have been released with these community rangers sort of calling in reports to say, and this includes things like whale sharks, manta rays, turtles have been caught in nets, and then the local government can go and help people to release them. And of course, sort of wide outreach activities with more than 1,000 people. So giving out posters to explain to people the different regulations and the different species that are protected. So based on this sort of integrated approach, which kind of includes little bits of everything that I talked about during the presentation today, we saw this decline in hunting effort. So there were much fewer hunting events per month throughout the years of the project, and this decline in manta ray landings per month. So, and both are statistically significant. So much fewer hunting events and much fewer manta rays killed over the timeline of the project. And in order to sort of try to robustly assess the impact, we compared manta ray hunting to devil ray hunting. And we sort of use devil rays as a quasi-control species because they're hunted and traded for the same international markets. So this was a test of, does the demand for gills still exist? Or, is this decline in manta ray hunting because of the fact that, international markets have changed? And we found that there's sort of a statistically significant decline in manta ray hunting, but no significant decline in devil ray hunting, and in fact an increase, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in one of my next slides. We also predicted the amount of manta rays we might expect to be hunted based on some sort of key ecological variables. And again, we found a significant difference between the actual observed manta ray landings and the predicted manta ray landings. So this was, again, sort of a control. So manta catches were significantly lower than predicted based on models using data from the pre-intervention years. So ongoing challenges, as I mentioned, there seems to be, we had this evidence of tactical displacement. So previously people were using harpoons to catch manta rays, and now they've transitioned to gill nets. And manta rays are still being caught in gill nets, but people are saying, you know, sort of accidental bycatch rather than targeted catch. And so we're seeing this shift towards manta rays being caught in gill nets instead of in harpoons. And we've seen this huge increase of devil ray landings as well. And this kind of makes sense, right? You know, as an alternative livelihood, devil rays aren't a protected species, and it's kind of the nearest available alternative that people might shift to. So it's kind of a need to strengthen local level fisheries management for devil rays and national policy frameworks for devil rays, and possibly to provide more meaningful incentives for local communities to protect marine megafauna in general, rather than just manta rays. And you often find this with conservation, it's a bit like whack-a-mole. You sort of solve one problem and then end up shifting people to another problem instead. And you know, these are some of the issues of alternative livelihoods mentioned previously. So in terms of broad conclusions, the project is having an impact, but certainly pressures and challenges remain. And multifaceted, multi-level approaches and working within local institutions are crucial for success. So to give a few lessons learned for conservation, it's really important to have an in-depth understanding of local context and the diverse drivers of illegal behaviour. Using data-driven, problem-oriented planning can help to ensure that interventions actually address the drivers. Targeting multiple drivers and multiple levels of wildlife trade using multiple tactics. So as I mentioned, we were doing a sort of fishery level approach and a trade level approach, and the sort of enforcement against national and international trade help to sort of you know, squeeze the supply chain and reduce the incentives for this trade. It's also really important to identify suitable impact measures. So it's actually quite rare that people sort of monitor the impacts of conservation interventions on a meaningful time frame to be able to implement adaptive management. So it's good if you can identify impact measures that are gathered frequently and that can support adaptive management and the calibration of interventions to evolving situations. So this conservation project sort of evolved over time, and every year the project team would get together, look at the data, you know, are landings declining, and what else can we do to sort of update and adapt the intervention. Quality and not just quantity is crucial for effective marine patrolling and enforcement, especially in resource limited situations. So as I mentioned about the marine patrols, we were able to use data to direct the marine patrolling towards spatial and temporal hotspots. And that was actually really important. It's not just about as many patrols as you can possibly do, because it's also very resource intensive, but it's about you know, using sort of data-driven and intelligence-led enforcement activities. Partnerships with diverse stakeholders and developing resilient local institutions can help to ensure enduring impact. So having this huge network of sort of ocean ambassadors and local patrolling groups, as well as the cooperative, is sort of really important for, you know, embedding those practices within the local community. Long-term commitment and adaptive management, particularly while profitable markets for wildlife products remain, and these problems are likely to evolve due to displacement, so you have sort of an arms race situation, is really important. You can't just sort of come in with a quick fix and then leave. Often these conservation issues require, you know, a real long-term sustained effort. And finally, regulation will not always and not alone effectively address conservation problems, but sometimes it helps. So, you know, having the CITES listing and the manta ray regulation in place provided the sort of the stage and the legal frameworks for this conservation project. But just having that policy on a piece of paper is not going to get you fewer dead manta rays. So it's good as a starting point, these sort of, you know, high level drivers, but then you have to combine you know, sort of regulatory frameworks with these real bottom-up approaches that can actually sort of address and change behavior. So take-home messages. We need to think about the ethical implications of our conservation actions. We need to understand what makes people tick and acknowledge this will be different for different people. We need to get the incentives right. We need to build robust institutional frameworks for lasting impact. And how can we do this? We can start with social sciences research methods to understand some of these issues. And we're going to talk more about that in detail tomorrow and over the coming days. So quick recap. By the end of the day, you should understand the moral and practical imperatives for considering the human dimensions of shark conservation, understand some theories of human behaviour, understand some approaches for changing behaviour in conservation, and when they might be useful. So we're going to have a final little poll. So present full screen. Oh, hang on a minute. I need to share it. So okay, why are human dimensions important? This is just a little recap on our learning objectives. You guys just want to write down some ideas. Again, I'll give it sort of 30 to 60 seconds before I start showing the answers. Nice. Sustainability, ethics, collaboration, conservation, inclusive. Behavior, effectiveness. Wicked problems. Oh, I like the little prawn. Very nice. So I think for me, you know, I often, the way I frame it is both practical and ethical reasons. So we have to consider human dimensions to deliver conservation outcomes, because all conservation is about behavior change. And we have to do conservation ethically. We need a moral code of conduct for conservation. And we should do no harm, especially to the most vulnerable people when we're implementing conservation. So ethics, equity, sustainability, fairness, I can see in there, behavior change. Brilliant, nice, okay. So I'm going to stop that poll for a second and go to the next one. So what are some approaches for changing behavior? Again, just type in a few answers and then I'll pop the results up in a minute. Incentives, education, alternatives, communication, regulation, empowerment, trust, brilliant. Awareness raising. I like to see actually that we've got incentives, alternatives, and education as the real big ones that are coming out, rather than your classic laws and enforcement. And of course, those are important. Regulations are definitely important. But it's nice to see these sort of more positive ones coming out. Attitudes, norms, economic open-mindedness, brilliant. Yeah, I think open-mindedness is key. Sort of understanding people. Carrots, very good. Interdisciplinary, yeah, really nice. Friendly is also crucial, I think. Mutual respect. Great. Give that a couple more seconds, and I'm going to go to the last one. Okay, nice. Oops. Where's that gone? Okay, and I have a question for you all about what are you hoping to get out of this course? We sort of already did the survey before the course to get people's inputs, and I really hope that we've tailored the content and the speakers around those needs and priorities for everybody. And you know, we've kind of already developed the agenda, so I can't promise that that we're going to be able to sort of change everything now, but I'm kind of interested in you know, what everyone is hoping to get from the course. And oh yeah, here we go. Is that working? No, wait, what have I done? I've accidentally. Oh, is that? Smart actions, perspective, new contacts, great. I definitely hope we'll do that. Humanity, broader understanding, ideas. Hope we'll give you some ideas, new tools. Brilliant. Yeah, I really hope, I like solutions as well. I'm hoping that we can do that. Holistic approaches, alternatives for new projects with community. Great. So there was also 2 other quick little polls that I missed earlier on, which I just really quickly would like us to do. So, okay, here we go. On a scale of 1 to 5, how important are human dimensions for short conservation? I sort of wanted to ask you all this before I'd done my spiel about how important human dimensions are. So this is a leading question now. But I would still quite like to get your answers on this. I'm going to give you all a few minutes and then I'll show some of the results. Yay! I should clarify that 5 being high and 1 being low. I saw somebody did 1 and then they seemed to have changed their mind. So, okay, great. And then, oops. Okay, on a scale of 1 to 5, how confident do you feel when it comes to applications of human dimensions? Just sort of interested to know how people feel about these topics before we get started. Well, that is a lovely normal distribution. Lovely bell curve. Okay, average of 3.12. Hopefully, we can re-ask this at the end and see if it's skewed to the right. Hopefully, it won't have skewed to the left. But yeah, that's great to see. Okay, so we've got a few minutes left. I'm going to stop sharing this. I've seen that there are lots of messages in the chat. And I think I'm going to just briefly hand over to Divya to see if I've not been paying attention to what's in the chat. So perhaps Divya can help with suggesting some questions.
Hi everyone. Yeah, so we've had a lot of discussion in the chat, especially about sustainability and how we can define it. And a lot of it was surrounding this idea of needing a lot of surveillance, especially with respect to discards and bycatch and keeping track of all of those things. I think people from like the global south in general have felt that it's a bit expensive to do those things. And we were wondering whether technology could help, or how can we think about sustainable shark fisheries if we can't really define the idea of sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, great and very tricky question. I guess my initial answer would be, actually trying to define sustainable limits for shark fisheries is incredibly hard. And for some species, a sort of easier approach might be, for now, how can we, limit mortality as much as possible within sort of feasible socioeconomic limits, I guess. So that, there are some simple things to do that can reduce mortality of certain species without necessarily having to do full science-based stock assessments. I sort of hope it's very challenging in small-scale fisheries, but at least in the commercial sector, in the future, things like video monitoring, onboard video monitoring with machine learning to help to identify cases when certain species are caught, and maybe things like eDNA for sort of forensic hold monitoring. You could use eDNA, and I think some researchers at CSIRO are doing this, where you can take a scoop out of a hold in a vessel and then sample that scoop to see which species were in that hold. But I appreciate technologies alone is not the answer. But I think things are improving in terms of efficiency of monitoring. I think there's some interesting ways to think about how, there's things like Global Fishing Watch, which is interesting for tracking where vessels are going, and how can we use that spatial footprint information to infer things like bycatch risk in a kind of sensible and meaningful way. So those are just some suggestions off the top of my head. But so I guess a combination of somehow trying to use technology to make monitoring more efficient, and then at the same time, I think not being trying to come up with sort of simple targets for fisheries in the beginning, rather than being focused on the idea that there has to be a really robust stock assessment before we can do anything. Maybe some simple measures first before those sort of clear limits are in place. Just some suggestions. I'm sure people in the audience would also have some great ideas as well. And it's good to see that there's been a lively conversation going on in the chat. That's great. So I think we're sort of at the end of the meeting. I realized I'm just going to very quickly, I had a little suggested reading list at the end that I'd forgotten to share. So there's a few papers there if anybody's interested. Some of the papers that I mentioned throughout the talk, in terms of some of these different behavior change approaches. You will not be examined on this, so don't worry, but just some suggested reading if anybody's interested. Will we share the PowerPoint? I'm sure that can be arranged, yes. And we are also going to make the whole recording available online as well. It's going to be, I think, on the Shark Specialist Group YouTube page, and it will be available on the website as well. So we can let you all know once that's all uploaded and available. we can send an email around to the shark specialist group. Okay, then, amazingly, I think we're sort of on time. So if we don't have anything else, I think we can wrap up. But thank you everybody for coming, and see you all on day 2.